Stop! Clips like these are what make people think that Japan is a weird and otherworldly country. This video will change how you see Japan forever, as I will debunk 8 different myths and misconceptions that many people still believe to this day. Many people decide not to go to Japan because they think that it's too expensive, and I really think that's a bummer because there's so much beautiful things to see and beautiful places and beautiful sceneries that you can visit anywhere you go in Japan. It's true that staying in Tokyo can get a little bit expensive, but Japan has so much more to offer than just Tokyo's main attractions. There are 47 prefectures in Japan. Some are predominantly rural, some are very urban like Tokyo, but I think finding a place that is a mix between rural and urban areas is probably the best experience, or you could also call it the true Japan experience because you can see more of the whole spectrum. For this video I prepared data for 7 different prefectures and compared them to Tokyo's data. There is a lot of detail contained in all of this data, but I will focus mainly on things that are important for foreign travelers. Of course, the source I used to get all of this data is in the description below if you want to check it out for yourself. When comparing Kyoto with Tokyo, you can see that rent and restaurant prices are quite a bit lower than in Tokyo, even though Kyoto is also a popular travel destination. This trend seems to be consistent when comparing other prefectures to Tokyo. Here are some other comparisons. If you want to analyze them in detail, you can just pause the video here. This is a graph I made to visualize the difference in cost for rent and restaurants between the 7 prefectures and Tokyo. I think it speaks for itself that there is a pretty big difference between Tokyo and the rest of Japan. Accommodations in Tokyo cost on average around 46% more than other prefectures. In terms of eating in restaurants, the approximate difference lies at around 17.5%, but keep in mind that this data refers to rather popular destinations. Of course, if one takes all the rural places into account, these averages go down even more, but because these places are the more popular ones, I think this data is more useful for this video. The prices of flights to Japan can depend on where you live and where you want to go, so in general it is hard to make an accurate data set. But I think flying to Tokyo is a little bit more expensive than if you fly to other prefectures. That's because the flight time can increase a lot if you go to unpopular destinations, due to there being less international flights that actually go there. One side note I want to make is that Tokyo's groceries are pretty cheap compared to most prefectures. The only prefecture in the data that has cheaper groceries is Sendai. Thinking that it's hard to travel to Japan with only English is a widespread misconception because many Japanese people don't speak English that well. But it's actually much easier than you think. Nowadays, almost all of urban Japan has English signs under the Japanese ones. Train stations and destinations are also displayed in English, and people in restaurants, hotels, or the airport speak good enough English to be able to help you if you have any questions. So you don't really need any Japanese to travel around. Of course, it can be very useful if you know some basic words. Nowadays, with internet and all those apps, it's very easy to just use them to translate whatever you want to say, so don't worry about the language barrier too much. If you still think that it's hard to meet or talk to Japanese people, I made a guide on meeting Japanese people in Japan. If you want to check that out, click in the top left corner on the annotation. Sushi is an important pillar for the Japanese cuisine that is represented by this huge temple and is probably the most famous one. But in Japan, there is so much more than just sushi to enjoy. The term washoku means traditional Japanese food, and there is a lot to be discovered like soba, ramen, udon, tempura, yakitori, sukiyaki. The list just goes on, and none of these have raw fish in it. I think parents using sushi and Japanese foods as synonyms when talking to their kids is a reason for this widespread thinking. France, for example, also has some raw specialties, and so do many other countries, so it's nothing special really. If you haven't tried other Japanese food besides sushi, I really recommend you to try it because it's amazing. And as you might have noticed, most of the things are not raw. People think that just because anime originated in Japan, people there watch anime every day and cosplay every evening with their friends and families, but that's not true. There are probably more hardcore anime enthusiasts in the West than in Japan. Of course, I can't prove that, but if you go outside of Akihabara, you won't really see people talk about or wear anything anime related. Of course, most people know Naruto and One Piece, and they probably watched it when they were younger. And there are huge anime fans also in Japan, but they're usually not very accepted into society. The so-called otaku doesn't just love something very much, but he surrounds himself with this thing almost an unhealthy amount. This is a general definition of the term, but the most widespread image that people see in their heads when they think about otaku in Japan is probably an anime nerd that sits in his room on his waifu pillow and plays games all day. These kind of people are usually looked down on in Japan. So as to summarize, the average Japanese citizen doesn't really watch anime or read manga on a regular basis, and I've never really met anyone who could be categorized as a real otaku. This is a very interesting topic, and if you want to learn or research more about it, I recommend to you a J-drama called Densha Otoko. Even though it's a little bit older, it really shows well how society treats an otaku and what it means to actually be one. It is apparently based on a true story, and the actors really do a phenomenal job at portraying the characters. This one is linked to the previous topic. Many people think that Japan is actually like an anime. Of course, many things like culture, food, or clothes are inspired from actual Japanese things, but they are portrayed in a very overdone manner, especially in shonen anime like Naruto, for example. If you go to Japan, I wouldn't expect a ninja to pop out of a side street and throw a shuriken at you, if you know what I mean. Japan actually has a very quiet and calm atmosphere around it. People mind their own business, they go to work, they do sports, they drink coffee in coffee shops, and so on. The crazy things that you see in anime or on Japanese TV are not really a frequent occurrence in Japan. Of course, if you go to Akihabara or similar places that are actually made for fan services like this, you might really see some very crazy stuff though. One thing I'd like to mention is that many sceneries in anime are actually inspired from real places, and that if you compare a high school slice of life anime to real life, it is much more accurate than a typical shonen anime. Many technical appliances and things have its origin in Japan, and they tend to do very well on the global market, but if you go to Japan and have a look around, you'd be surprised by how many people still use those small and unpractical phones. Of course, the speaking toilets, the high-speed trains, and the vending machines can fool you at first glance, but many other things are kept very traditional in Japan. For example, many people in Japan don't use computers, nor do they really buy anything from the internet. Japanese people don't use streaming platforms for music or movies. They go and rent them in rental shops that you can find literally anywhere in Japan. One more thing is that, like in the old days, in the good old 8th century, they still use little stamps for signing their name on official business. They're called hanko stamps and look a little bit like this. In many places in Japan, you will freeze off your feet. Central heating is not a very common thing in Japanese houses, especially if you are on the countryside. Every Japanese apartment has an air conditioner that can put warm air into the apartment, but that's it. No real heating, which can be very stressful sometimes. I really like this traditional attitude because it gives meaning to things and it takes out a little bit of this speed that a lot of us have to keep up with nowadays. This might be something that we actually could learn from. If you're talking about Shinkansens, the most famous and fastest Japanese trains, then yes, they're always on time. But normal trains like the underground Chikatetsu, not so much. Because of all those people that go in and out, and also the congestions that happen on a daily basis in the train line systems, trains actually run late around half of the time. It's not really that bad though, because it's only like 1 or 2 minutes, and also on every train line there is like one train every 5 minutes, so it's really not that big of a deal. It's still not true though. It just can happen, you know, if you go to Japan, just keep in mind, some trains just run late sometimes. It's probably still better than it is in Western countries. A lot of people think that slurping your noodles is something that you can use to show that you like the food or that everybody has to do it, but in actuality, slurping your noodles is not really something that compliments the chef. Nor does it have any other functions besides maybe eating fast or tasting the broth with the noodles. Most Japanese people just do it since they were a child, so it doesn't really have a bigger meaning behind it. You can just be a slurper if you want to, or be no slurper if you don't want to.